So, Governor, let's start out with this pandemic thing that everybody's kind of been talking about a lot. Um, so, generally, the state and yourself have earned good marks on handling the crisis. One thing that we have heard criticism about has been masks. You wear one in public, in groups, but you have refused to mandate them or even under your emergency powers give it communities the authority to mandate them. Um, so is there a reason for that?
Well, yeah, well, a couple things. First, communities can absolutely mandate them. We've always been very, very supportive of that. And communities have. There's over, I think, a dozen or so communities throughout New Hampshire that have their own mask mandates, and we are supportive of that, absolutely. When it comes to the actual mandates, a couple things. First off, the citizens of New Hampshire have done a phenomenal job with their social distancing, wearing of the mask. When you go out, people are out there, they're using them, and the results show it. I mean, there's a reason why we have some of the lowest COVID numbers in the country and some of the lowest hospitalization and death rate and all of those sorts of things, because people are really, I think, are listening and adhering to that elevated message between Dr. Chan and myself and Lori and the whole team. You have a lot of stores that are already putting those into place, and we're very supportive of all that. At the same time, you have over 50% of the towns, I think it's something like 60% of the cities and towns that have no COVID. Absolutely none, like not even a single current case of COVID. So you have to understand that for us that live in either larger metropolitan areas or in the southern tier, it's much more prevalent than it is in other parts of the state. And by the way, it's always another card I could play. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. I will never do it. We could absolutely do that. But once you go for the full mask mandate, in a way, that's kind of one of your final cards to play. The citizens of the state have done a great job. If I were to do it, it would not come without controversy. A lot of folks and businesses in those cities and towns would be upset. And again, we try not to listen to that noise, but just make sure that whatever we're doing, we're getting the best results. And so far, we've gotten phenomenal results. So we can still do it if we need to do it in the future. And I think as the numbers increase, if we start seeing that percent positive, starting to really move up. I mean, right now, I think yesterday our percent positive was 0.4%. That's about a tenth of the percent positive of the rest of the country. And we've done it without a statewide mask mandate. So it could be a useful tool down the road if that number starts to really move. But I think communities have handled it very well. Businesses handled it. And the citizens really deserve the credit for maintaining their social distancing, doing those things that we've asked of them, making those restrictions and those sacrifices in their personal lives to keep our numbers down.
And so what would it take to spur you to tighten restrictions on businesses, on being in public? The state's been opening up slowly with some success, but there are signs here and elsewhere that more cases may crop up as the weather cools and schools are back in session.
I've always said the numbers are going to go up. We've been talking about that for months. That should not be a shock to anybody when our numbers really start to climb here into the fall. That's fully expected and very much manageable. To your question, when we talk about restrictions, one thing we've done very well in this state is be very data-driven, very specific about businesses within the business sector, whether it's bowling alleys or healthcare centers or whatever it might be. They all have their own guidance and restrictions. Schools have their own guidance and restrictions. So as the numbers start to move, I think we've created a system that allows us to be nimble. And what I mean by that is we can say, well, maybe the southern tier or these counties might have more restrictions. These counties don't. These business sectors might have more restrictions, maybe more restrictions around the university. So it's not just one set of data or or just a blanket restriction that we would start increasing upon the citizens of the state. We can be very nimble and specific to really attack the areas that we're starting to see those outbreaks really crop up. Because when you're data driven, you can also look at not just if the number is rising, but why is it rising, right? What are those things that are contributing? And that's why having such a great team of Lori and Dr. Chan and Lisa and all these folks at Public Health, they're very, very focused on the data and the contact tracing, right? Remember, we're one of the best states in the country when it comes to contact tracing. Early on, many states got rid of their contact tracers. They kind of gave up on it. We doubled down. we understood that through contact tracing, we have the ability to identify individuals, who they came in contact with, why, their proximity, all of those types of things that go into our data analysis. So it isn't one set of data or one specific industry. The most important pieces of data that we look at and will continue to look at are hospitalizations. Is our healthcare system going to get overrun? If you remember, that was the #1 concern back in March and April. If the healthcare system if we're not managing this right, you're going to see what you saw in Italy or China or even other states, even Massachusetts, where some of the hospitals were so full they almost couldn't take any more COVID patients. We wanted to make sure we didn't get an overrun system where you literally, unfortunately overseas, you saw literally people dying in their homes and in their streets because they couldn't get into other facilities. So knowing that we only have about 20 hospitalizations, but literally 2,000 beds available, more than 2,000 beds available for COVID patients, gives us a lot of flexibility to handle and manage those with the most severe symptoms. And then obviously the percent positive, right? If you just look at the number of cases increasing, 20, 50, 40, 100, 200, 300, the difference is 4 or 5 months ago, we were doing 500 to 1,000 tests a day. Now we average 10,000 tests a day. And that's not by accident. I mean, we worked very hard to get our number there. And I think the number of tests per day is just going to go up. So you just have to be careful about only identifying the raw number. You have to put it into relation and perspective for those individuals and the overall system.
And so looking at it the other way, what would you be looking for metric-wise that would signal to you that it's time to end the state of emergency?
Well, the state of emergency, I don't think it's a strict metric. There's a couple things that come into play with the state of emergency, if I may. Number one, flexibility. It allows me the flexibility to invest in PPE, invest in testing, be very quick, be very nimble. And if I had not had that ability, if I had to go through a legislative process, if I had to get caught up in bureaucracy, no pandemic is handled better in a bureaucracy. You have to react and react quickly. So the state of emergency allows me to be very flexible and cut the deals, and that's why we've been so good in kind of a model, if you will, for getting PPE and getting testing materials. There are a lot of things in the state of emergency that I would love for the legislature to take over when they come back into session. Telemedicine, things of that nature. You can go down a whole list. A lot of those orders, I think the legislature should take up, either on an interim basis or maybe even make permanent for the long term. I think telemedicine is a big win for the state. We've shown that it can work very well. But I think the legislature should take those things up. And so what I'd like to do is, while the state of emergency will exist, we can at least start paring back a lot of the orders that when the legislature left, we had to just move on very, very quickly. But ultimately, until we get a vaccine out there is really readily available to, I think, almost everyone, where folks really have the choice whether they want to vaccinate it or not. And we'll see kind of how that's taken up. We really don't know for sure how many people are going to take the vaccine, how effective it will be. Those are some of the unknown data variables that we'll be looking at when we make the decision to eventually, hopefully, come out of the state of emergency.
Okay. So the one other thing I think about the pandemic that you've come under fire a little bit about is for taking pretty much sole control over deciding on handing out 1.2 billion, or I think maybe it's been like almost 1.5 total.
1.25 billion is what we were allocated,
in CARES Act money. And we've heard from even conservatives saying that stuff should be run through the fiscal committee or the executive council, that's literally what their job is. And so can you explain how having your own ad hoc panel is less time consuming than going through, say, the 5 members of the council or the members of the fiscal committee?
So to bring something to the executive council adds 6 to 8 weeks to any standard process. I don't think anything in the history of government has gone through a legislative process quickly. So when we were early on in this pandemic, when I was on the phone with folks in China and South Korea, Italy, places where we were just trying to get anything we could. Remember, you couldn't find gloves, you couldn't find masks, you couldn't find anything. I was literally on the phone all night long in the middle of the night, and they're saying, look, Governor, I got a plane load of gowns. I got a plane load of respirators. I got a plane load of this. Are you in or are you out? If I said to them, well, I'll get back to you in a couple of days when the legislature decides, the deal's gone before I've hung up the phone. And so because I could move so quickly on that, and those are big deals, those are multi-million dollar deals. And I had literally FEMA on one side, and I had, because I cut them in on the deal because they agreed to pay for a lot of the shipping of it. That was really good, by the way. It's very expensive to ship. And I had these guys on this end working with our private partners through Dean Kamen and some other folks in China. Boom, we were able to cut those deals fast, and it was done. Other states were reeling. They were calling us to find out how we were doing deals so well. Same with testing materials, right? Whether it was getting them here or talking to folks overseas about bringing testing materials in, some of the experimental stuff we were looking at. So the nimbleness and the quickness that anybody, any governor or CEO needs in an emergency situation. The pandemic, like I said, a legislative process is not conducive for a pandemic. All those deals wouldn't have happened, and we would have been back in the mix with all these other states, as opposed to being the gold standard. And I'll tell you this, the fact that we were so good at allowing me to cut those deals, and by the way, fully transparent. There's nothing we have done where we were talking to the public on a daily basis, if you remember, with the press conferences every step of the way. Because when I said we're in this together, you can say that, or you can really do it. And so making sure that everyone knew what we knew, everyone knew that our philosophy and how we're making decisions. And if you remember, I would take every question from the press, every question people could think to ask. I wouldn't end that press conference till people were exhausted, right? I outlasted the press. I get a gold medal for that one. But I mean, that was a very important part of the process so that folks knew, yes, I had ultimate authority to make these decisions, but people were going to know what we were doing and when we were doing it and how. And because of that, you have the federal VA, the Federal Veterans Administration. Their own bureaucracy is such a mess. We are now the #1 facilitator of PPE to the VA around the entire country. We bring in plane loads and plane loads and plane loads, and they essentially buy the plane loads off of us because it's so much faster to buy it from the state of New Hampshire than it is to get it on the open market, because they have to go through that legislative fiscal committee bureaucratic process that just slows them down and has really inhibited and prohibited the ability to get PPE to their frontline doctors and their healthcare workers and their patients. So again, having that flexibility to do it not only just allowed me to do it, but I'm very proud. We were, as a team, we were able to do it so well, we became the gold standard where the federal government's coming to us for their stuff.
Well, not to be argumentative, Governor, but a lot of the CARES Act money didn't get distributed out on in short order. It went through your Gophers.
Yeah.
So I guess
if I may, with a legislative advisory board that knew what we were doing the whole way, with Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate, I created that board. I created that independent board so they could see and also give us ideas, right? They're a great kind of connection to a lot of the citizens that said, you know what, maybe we need more in childcare here. Hey, we're having a problem with healthcare over there. And so they were part of that process. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I mean, having that board, it wasn't solely, I could make the decisions when I had to, but we did have a lot of input and bipartisan process there.
Okay. I guess it's not a lot of different from going to a small legislative committee, though.
Oh, sure it is, because a small legislative committee, you have to notice it 24 hours in advance. They have to get public testimony. They have to hear about it. Politics gets involved. It becomes a mess. What small legislative committees ever work quickly? It just doesn't happen. Meanwhile, you had hospitals that were on the verge of closing. If I had to go through a legislative committee when LRGH was literally days away from closing and just they had no cash to pay their bills, I was able to move that money out immediately. We were the first state in the country to create a healthcare relief fund, the first one in the country to do it. And so because we were able to do that and be nimble, we kept those doors open. We kept those providers, both small and large. They said, look, the state's going to be there for us. We don't have to panic. The state's going to be there. If there's an emergency, we can call the state. They can open up the fund. The Governor Sununu can cut the checks, and at least we have that security of knowing. And so they weren't in a mode of just furloughing on day one, right? They could actually stay open, see what it was going to look like, and we could manage through that whole process and fundamentally keep those doors open, which was the most important thing for the citizens to know. that they were going to have that security, right? When you have that anxiety of this unknown pandemic, how's it going to affect me or my family? Are my parents going to be able to get a respirator if they need one? God forbid they should get COVID. Every door stayed open. And that security would not have been there if I had to go through bureaucracy. Bureaucracy always slows things down.
Well, just to put one last thing on that issue, though, Governor, is under the emergency powers, it would seem that you'd have had the ability to bypass some of those legislative processes, and particularly with the council, to get them to sign off on that stuff.
Well, again, I could, and that's what I did. I mean, I had the ability to bypass it. That's what they did, and that's why we were so successful. The legislature said, hey, but we want in. And the council, I mean, even as today, Deborah Pignatelli said, I don't agree with anything you're doing, Governor, because you didn't come to the executive council process and blah, blah, blah. So even today, they're still fighting me to slow things down. It would have been a disaster. It really would have been. We would have been caught in this massive bureaucracy. It would have slowed everything down. It would have put politics in it. So instead, we had the input of both sides of the aisle without the clogging of the system, if you will.
I would like to pivot to a different public health issue that the state is dealing with. Obviously, COVID has taken front and center over the last few months, but we're still dealing with an opioid crisis. And I'm curious, at present, what is the biggest challenge in making progress in that battle?
Well, let's take a step back. The opioid, every year coming into 15 and 2016, the opioid numbers were skyrocketing, right? There was no end in sight for any of it. So when we came in, we did a couple things. First, we said, we're going to do it different. You can't keep pumping money into the same old system and expect better results. And so first we got more funding. There used to be $3.5 million in the alcohol fund. I got it to 10. And I made it so taxpayers didn't have to pay. It comes from a charitable contribution with the deal I cut with the hospitals, right? So we took that piece out of the equation. And then once people realized we had funds at the table, I said, well, now we have to redesign a new system. And I came up with the idea for the doorways. Rural access to care was the biggest barrier we faced. And in many ways, we still faced, because I designed a system, and you probably heard the story. I sat up one night and I just kept putting pins in the map until I figured out a way that no one would have to drive more than 45 minutes from their home, because you didn't want people to lose their jobs or be disincentivized about losing access to their kids if it was a real serious issue or whatever it might be, and make sure that it wasn't just a treatment service, but full wraparound services as part of each of these, what we ultimately called the doorways, each of these hubs, if you will. I then put that on paper and I went to the White House. We went down to Washington and we said, this is where we need grant money. We can set up this system. It's a whole new way of doing it, and it ensures that we're going to get much more participation. So that's really gets to the crux of your answer, getting more folks to say, I'm going to walk through that door because I know I'm going to get wraparound services. I can stay in my home. I can get care in my community. I don't have to go to downtown Manchester, maybe 150 miles away from my kids and my job and all that. We created recovery-friendly workplaces, something I had previously invented at Waterville Valley. We invented it for the state. And today we have hundreds and hundreds of employers now under that new system. And what it has done, it's allowed people to say, because having a job and work and self-worth is such an important part of that recovery process. And so what we've allowed people to say is, look, I can go to my employer. I can talk to them about my addiction, and I want to get on a path of recovery. I don't necessarily lose my job or lose access to my kids. I can go to the doorway and get services right in my community. And the doorway's been an absolute home run across. I can't tell you, I was shocked when Dan Feltis was out in Cheshire saying that the system wasn't working, because Cheshire is the gold standard for the doorway. That's how well it's working. Cheshire Medical has been an awesome partner in the doorway system. In fact, we refer other doorways to Cheshire Medical and how they've been managing it because it's been so successful. You know, hundreds of people every month walking through that door. So I think statewide, we have literally thousands of people walking through the doorways now, getting those full wraparound services, co-occurring issues, co-diagnoses that was not happening. If you're just in a treatment center, you're not necessarily getting a co-diagnosis of all the other issues, whether they're physical or mental issues or whatever it might be. But now you can get that full wraparound services. So the biggest barrier has been allowing folks to get access in their communities. The doorway's been a complete home run. It's only been running for about a year, and then, we hit COVID. So that's kind of, thrown a wrench in every type of program we have across the state. but already we're getting great results. The numbers are continuing to go down, but we got a ways to go, to be sure, but making sure that that rural access to care keeps getting enhanced. And those providers, some of those small providers, what we call our spokes to the hub of the doorway system, that they're there for those individuals in all those different communities.
On that note, we've heard from some of the service providers that make up those spokes that say that they could use some more funding to handle the things that are being asked of them. Is that something that is being worked on in your office? And if so, where would that money possibly come from?
Sure. So let's understand. Under the previous administration, the state put about $3.5 million. Last year, we put $60 million. 60, right? Because we got $50 million when I went to Washington. They created the fund that we got the biggest grant in the country. To recreate our system. And that was $50 million. And we're going to get another $50 million to keep the system going because it's been so successful with the SOR grant. The SOR grant has been a phenomenal tool for us. So we've already created a system that tripled the amount of in-state money. And now we've gotten all this giant federal money. Money is not the direct issue here. It's really not, considering we have literally 20 times the amount of money that you did under the previous administration.
So I had one more COVID question for you here, and that is that there's been a lot of back and forth, particularly in the past couple of days, about the negotiations at the federal level on another stimulus package, and it doesn't look like, even if that happens, that that package would include aid that is specifically targeted to the state and local governments and schools. If the feds don't come through with that kind of aid, are there ways that the state would try to help towns and school districts with some of the costs they've been bearing?
So a couple things. Congress has been an absolute letdown when it comes to COVID. The last bill that they got done, I think, was March or April. I mean, they've literally gotten nothing done since the very beginning of this pandemic. They did 3 bills in a row. It was great, a lot of momentum, and then they pulled back. They made a lot of commitments, and they got nothing done. So I can't tell you what a disappointment they've been. I know the last negotiation, as of about a week ago, I believe Secretary Mnuchin had offered somewhere in the realm of $1.6 trillion, $250 billion of which would have gone to state and local governments. There was another $250 million or so that would have gone to education. So that was in the plan that the administration was offering at the time. I think Pelosi wanted $2.2 billion. They offered 1.6, and then all of a sudden it fell apart. So that's disappointing on many levels. When it comes to support for cities, towns, and schools, we've already put in $40 million on the education side. We've put in additional money. It's called a GEARS money that comes out of my office. We have about $9 million. We put millions in from there. Every city and town has gotten an allocation to cover their COVID costs. We helped pick up a lot of the costs on cities and towns when we did the stipends for first responders and things of that nature. Tens of millions of dollars there. So we've already put in a ton of money. Now, I've always said, if a school district needs more money, let us know. Let us know what the need is, why it's there, and we're going to be there for them. And that's why I tried not to spend all the money, which I didn't. I still have a couple $100 million today because we don't know what the fall is going to bring. We don't know what challenges were going to come when they opened up schools. And so I think we were very smart about how we planned it. And I know the Legislative Advisory Board, as part of Gopher, is looking at either a model or how much money they're looking to allocate. I know they're hearing from a lot of school districts, as we have as well. And I've looked to them and say, okay, give me some ideas about how you think, not just how much money goes, but how does the allocation, is it a per capita or a capitated rate, like every child, you give money to each district per every child or something of that nature. So they're working on those models, and I think there's opportunity. I want to say there's about, I'm doing this off the top of my head, about 60 schools out of our 450 schools that are looking for some additional funds, meaning they've used all the money we gave them for COVID. Their cities and towns have exhausted their funds as well. There's about 60 schools that are affected by that. And so we're just going back to them and saying, okay, what do you need? Why? Where does the money go? There are federal rules that are attached to these dollars. So we got to make sure that they adhere to the federal rules. Otherwise, the feds are going to come and claw it all back. So we're working with the LAB, our Legislative Advisory Board, as part of Gopher. We're working with the schools directly, and we're working with the feds to make sure what those needs are all match up. And then we have the funds that we can start distributing, I think, in very short order. I thought they were going to take it up yesterday. I think they met yesterday, and they chose not to take it up. And I think they're going to defer to next week to get some more data. The LAB is going to defer to next week and then come back with some suggestions. And we work with that group of Republicans and Democrats very closely in terms of what the needs are. The legislature is really one of the best bodies when you integrate at that local level, because they have such great representation, especially through our House, to figure out what the needs really are and then find a fair system for everyone.
So today you signed an executive order implementing more than 20 of the recommendations from the commission that you convened on law enforcement accountability, community, and transparency. So just wondering, what more do you think needs to be done in the short term and in the long term on the issues of social justice and racial equality?
Well, let me start by saying I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I am so proud of that group. During a time of massive strife across this country and social unrest on these issues. I think folks in this state, and I'm proud to say we really led the charge. From the first protest, when I picked up the phone and was talking to the folks at Black Lives Matter and the ACLU and law enforcement. If you remember one of those first protests in Manchester where we made sure the police actually gave their folks an escort all the way to the police department so they could protest, because we all said the same thing and we believe it. There's a powerful and important message there that isn't just enough to talk about. You got to respond. You got to respond with real action. And so they wanted to do a 6-month study and all this of what we could do. And I said, no way, you got 30 days. Because action demands action, right? You got to move on this stuff. You can't just sit around on it. So I gave them 30 days. The AG asked us and the group asked us for 30 more. And I said, fine. We gave them 60, but I said, we're not going to wait around. We got to move. What they came back with, and by making sure you had Black Lives Matter, the ACLU, the county prosecutors, representatives of the chiefs of state police and of the patrol association, law enforcement, right there in the same room, hand in hand, they came back with 48 recommendations that were 100% agreed on. I don't know any other state that did that, right? And we led by saying we might not all agree on every detail, but we're going to work hard and work it out. And they did dozens of these public meetings and public testimony. And the fact that they came back with 48 recommendations, I think was awesome. Now, the 20 or so that I did today through an executive order, so let me take it 1.5 step back. As soon as I got that, I brought them all to lunch. It was funny. It was the first time the group had ever gotten together because they had done everything on Zoom. And so we all had a lunch and we came in, we had our masks on and all of this, and we had a lunch. And I went through, I took I'd gone through it myself, but then I went through the recommendations. We went through one by one, every single one, because I wanted to understand what it was, what the spirit and intent was, what they heard from the public. And then we decided as a group, well, this is legislative. We can do this with an executive order. This will require funding. And we managed the process. So it didn't just become a study that we said, see, we did a study, give us a pat on the back. So many administrations do that. We don't do that. We want to know we're going to get action. So we took that, and out of that discussion came about the 20 or so executive orders, one executive order with 20 or so, not just recommendations, but actions we're now going to take, a lot in conjunction with police standards and training, a lot. There's just a lot there. You can read it for yourself. It was pages of stuff that we all put together. And then the other half or so, the 20 or so, will require a little more funding and more of a legislative oversight. Some things just require legislative input that I just cannot do through an executive order. And so what I've done is I'm actually writing the bill myself. Our team is, even though the legislature is not in session, and we're going to give it to the leadership in both parties in both houses of the Senate and the House to be the co-sponsors of that bill, because there shouldn't be any politics involved, and say, look, here's the bill, here are the recommendations, it's all written out, go get it done, get this stuff passed in the legislature. So that's really the next major step Also working with police standards and training and making sure that some of those things that we can do in short order, like body cams, like we can go out and start purchasing body cameras today. It was a recommendation. I firmly believe in it. Let's get it done. Some of the things on police standards and training. There were 4 or 5 different significant recommendations for John Skippa, who runs police standards and training. He was right there as part of the process. Says, yep, we can do this. We can do this. We might need a software program for this. We might need to bring in an outside group for that. But he's doing it. He is all in on it. I don't know any other place in the country where you have that kind of, I'll say both from a bipartisan nature and also from having both sides, if you will, of the issue, right? Both sides, both law enforcement and Black Lives Matter, really coming together, not butting heads, but coming together as one, saying, we both agree, we all agree this can and should be done. I think it's awesome. And I think that report is just a phenomenal product. They worked so hard to do it. We led the charge, and now we're actually taking action. So there's a lot more to do, to be sure. And the last thing I'll leave you with on that one, which I love, I said, it has to be a living, breathing document. This isn't a one shot, and then we'll come back in 5 years and see how we did. We got to have something where every 6 months or every year, every legislative session, we go back and we look at what we tried, what worked, what didn't, what new adjustments need to be made, continually bring folks of that group back together again to have this discussion. It worked so well the first time, there's no reason it can't keep working. And that way, when these issues come up, we're right on top of it. We're not reacting. We're being really proactive to these issues, and we already have the infrastructure in place to deal with what might come tomorrow.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, about, the future and, what more to do. But I mean, are there issues that you still see out there that need to be addressed, or, larger issues that that you'd like to take steps toward looking at?
Well, around those issues of social justice, I think the 48 recommendations touch upon a little bit of everything. I mean, they left no stone unturned. Issues of implicit bias, issues of training, issues of approach, issues of community policing, of mental health supports. I mean, you can just body cameras and accountability, issues of public disclosure. They really jumped on all of it. So I'm really going to defer to them, the experts, the stakeholders that are in the field that came to those conclusions and recommendations. And I think those are all both the immediate first steps, and some of them are really long term. Some of them think very proactively down the road, which I love. I think we really have to get on not just within law enforcement, but also take some of these issues of implicit bias. Way before this, we had this issue of George Floyd of this year. When I became governor, I realized they didn't even have a civil rights unit. No governor had even created a civil rights unit in the Attorney General's office. I couldn't believe that. We were the only state without one. I immediately set that up. I created a commission on inclusion and diversity with folks from all across the state to actually go out and talk to communities as a whole, whether it's schools, places of worship, law enforcement, community centers, whatever it might be, so that they could get the feedback, what was really happening out there, and allow us to say, well, we have issues of implicit bias here, you have issues of overt bias there, of racism there. We have elements of racism in our community all throughout America. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, unfortunately, right? And I think for a long time, there's been an acceptance, and it's not appropriate. And so finally, we're saying, what else can we do? This started a couple of years ago here in New Hampshire, as soon as I became governor, and now we're just kind of taking that to the next level. So the good news is that when these issues specifically around George Floyd spurred up, we weren't starting from scratch going, what do we do now? We already had an embedded, invested team that were working on these issues at some level, and I think that's why we were so successful with the LEAC Commission, because we were already going down that path. Hassett administration, Lynch administration never touched it. I mean, and remember, the racial unrest was starting in 2015 and 2016. None of this was set up then, but we got right on it. And that allowed us, when the crises really started to happen, we weren't just reacting to a crisis. We had the infrastructure we could rely on. We had the stakeholders who already had a voice with our office. And I think that gave them the confidence to move forward in conjunction to get all of what you saw in that LEAC Commission done.
Switching gears here to healthcare, which is something that is definitely on the minds of many people in New Hampshire. How do you think we can make healthcare more affordable in the state? Wow,
that's a great question. Healthcare is not very affordable right now. It's really not. We expanded Medicaid. That was a big one. And when I came into office, I think a lot of folks said, he's going to cut expanded Medicaid. No, we championed it. And even with the Republican legislature and some folks that were concerned about how that looked, we were able to go to that legislature and work through the process, show how it took care of uncompensated care, showed how it allowed more prevention medicine and things of that nature for a large population that otherwise was completely off the health insurance rolls, and allowed them to be healthier. When you allow more folks to come into the system and be healthier early on and be preventative, that in itself lowers healthcare costs. Secondly, prescription drugs. I was out there championing, making sure we could get the prescription drug reforms that we did this year, which were phenomenal, whether it's bringing in stuff from Canada, whether it was the price caps on insulin, which is very important, and actually walking folks through the steps of why the math works, right? And it allows people just better and easier access. And when they have easier access, they're more apt to use the system, get that preventative care, and that way you don't have the long-term care problems later in life. And in essence, that's why we've seen premiums. I mean, premiums are going to come down 16% this year. I think in my first 2 years, they went down about 10% each year. They're coming down 16% this year because we're just getting much more proactive about that preventative medicine. When it comes to health insurance premiums, that's a little different than just the cost of care. But competition is huge. You need competition in the system. If you only have one big dog providing all the health care, there's no incentive. I mean, that's why you end up with like Tylenols that cost $47, right? And all this kind of crazy stuff. So by creating competition in the system, a lot of the emergency services and the things like the Clear Choice or Convenient MDs or those types of emergency care, those smaller things. So if your son has an ear infection or an earache or he has a cough or maybe he sprains his wrist, you don't have to go to the emergency room every time for that anymore. In most communities, you have another option. So that lowers the cost of healthcare for those individuals. It creates more competition and forces those larger entities, maybe it's just a hospital or something like that, to be more competitive on their pricing. So all of these, I'm throwing a lot at you, I know, but all of these are pieces that we've implemented very aggressively here in the past 2 or 3 years to actually start getting our healthcare costs well under control. We got a ways to go. I mean, we really do. I'd love to see more insurance companies fighting for their premiums to lower those. Some of the challenges, I'll just say, that were created in the late 90s, we're still paying for those because that chased a lot of those decisions back in the late 90s, chased a lot of the insurance companies out of here. I mean, a lot of us still remember when there were 10 or 12 health insurance companies in the state. Now there's 3 or 4. And when I came in, there were basically 2, and now we're up to 3 or 4. And we're trying to make them more competitive and a little more robust in what they can offer in terms of choices for individuals. But, I think there's a lot there. Competition is absolutely huge in both the insurance and the private sector side. And then also, again, making sure that preventative medicine isn't just available, but really being used. And we're kind of following up, if you will, with folks. Are you getting your checkup? Have you gone in for your blood work? Something as simple as those phone calls, which we do now very aggressively to make sure people are getting their care. It'll save us millions of dollars on the back end and give those individuals a much better quality of life later on.
That actually leads right into my next question, which is about sort of that competition. I mean, here in the Monadnock region and probably in other more rural regions in New Hampshire, we don't have a lot of the competition in terms of medical providers. We can't go to like a freestanding center and get, your surgery done. You can't get the MRI done or something like that. I mean, what can the state do to sort of attract more medical providers to the area?
So the key around getting more medical providers is workforce. And I've been very aggressive about enhancing medical workforce here in the state. When I became governor, we had no LPN nursing program, none. And it was a nurse. It was a nurse herself sitting at the Red Cross across the table. We were talking about something totally unrelated. And she said, I have my LNA, but I'd like to get an LPN. That's kind of the next step because I'm a working mom and I don't have time to go to get my RN, but you don't provide it here. It's only in Massachusetts. And I went, what are you talking about? And we dug in and we figured out the community colleges had gotten rid of their LPN program. That's kind of the middle version of a nurse program, if you will. So I said, well, we're changing that. And I went right in, and after 10 years of not having it, we now have LPN programs in the state. I went to UNH and I looked at the nursing program there, and I said, okay, we want to expand this. I don't just want to expand it. I want to double the size of this program so we can go from 80 to 100 nurses to 160 to 200 nurses. And then with, I think, Portsmouth Hospital and Exeter, what's going on in Manchester, Dartmouth, there's opportunities there that we're going to kind of make it a seamless transition from high school, right? Because in a lot of our CTEs, you can now take, in the last couple of years, I've created programs, you can now take nursing programs in high school and start down that credentialing path. And then when you have, the dual and concurrent enrollment, you can be in high school and still take classes at the community college that then transfer to UNH if you want to be a nurse there with double the number of nurses. Now, when the Democrats passed their first budget back in June of 2019, I should say, they had taken the money I put in to double the size of the nursing program. They had pulled that out. They pulled all the money out for Keene State. They pulled all the money out for UNH. It was gone. So I vetoed that budget because it was unbalanced. There's a lot of reasons why I vetoed that budget, but that was one of them. And I came back, and one of the things I was insistent on, they wouldn't give me the money back for Keene State. There was $9 million in there for Keene State. They wouldn't give it to me, but I fought hard and I got at least the nursing program back in at UNH. And again, it's all about making it a seamless transition for students. You don't wait for a student to go to college and say, gee, would you like to become a nurse? Gee, would you like to enter the medical field? If you start that process early on in high school, because I'm excited about high school, it gives them a kind of not just a new activity, but a real career skill that they get excited about and that they can really build on. So our workforce, whether it's nursing or other areas, we try to bring that all the way back to freshman year, 8th grade, right? I believe workforce starts in middle school. I really believe that, and the proof is in there. And nursing is a big part of that. So, we lose a lot because we are literally 30 miles away from the biggest medical hub on the planet, right? Boston is just one of the most attractive, one of the most advanced medical hubs. And we're very fortunate in New Hampshire to be near that. I don't want to be too down on it. It's wonderful that we also have some access to that great medical hub. But what it does mean is that's a very attractive place for a lot of our nurses and doctors to go. It's very easy for them just to go down there. It's incredibly high pay at an incredibly high level and quality of care. So making it attractive here and allowing those nurses and doctors to plant their roots here early on. I know it's different. I know other administrations didn't want to take this path. I believe in it. I believe that workforce starts early, but it all comes with options and choices for the kids as students to make sure that they can plant those roots and be here for when we need them the most.
Just a quick follow-up about sort of the healthcare. Some of the systems are kind of merging and becoming bigger. Do you have any concerns about, just a few hospital groups kind of being responsible for most of the healthcare in the state?
Very concerned. Oh yeah. No, I get very concerned. Anytime you have super large systems and it's reducing that competition, taking over, even though the quality of care may be there, they can provide good quality care, the costs are inevitably going to go up, right? Hospital mergers can be a good thing, but they can also be very, very dangerous. And I get very nervous about that. Or massive healthcare systems, because when you lose competition, you lose incentive to lower costs. That's the nature of everything. So I get very concerned about that. Obviously, Partners is looking at an expansion up here at another one in Exeter Hospital. That we're looking at that carefully. We're going to be fair about it, but it obviously I think gives a lot of people pause for concern. Anytime two hospital systems merge. Now, sometimes mergers have to happen. We just had one. Rochester, right? Frisbee merged essentially with Portsmouth, but that was out of really financial crisis. Frisbee for years was going through some very tough times, and Portsmouth not just merged, but acquired them and was able to enhance a lot of their programming and systems that they needed up in Rochester. And so I think that was a very good merger and a very good opportunity the state took advantage of. But you got to be careful anytime you get massive systems in charge of something that's so necessary. These aren't optional products. These aren't just widgets that you can choose to buy or not to buy. We all need healthcare and we all need quality care, but it absolutely has to be affordable. If it's not affordable, then we've done a disservice to the whole system and most importantly, to the constituents that are relying on it.
Governor, just a quick question. I think among the issues that you've had disagreement with the legislature on is paid family leave. And I wonder if you could just sort of explain what your approach on it would be, what might be doable in your view, And also, you've criticized Democratic proposals on this for being an income tax, and I wonder how you might distinguish that from other employer taxes like the business enterprise tax or unemployment taxes.
Sure. So paid family leave should happen in New Hampshire. It's a great idea. It can happen. And I've put 3 different plans forward to do paid family leave without an income tax. So the first time we did it as part of the budget. The last 2 years we've done it as part of separate bills because they wanted to find middle ground on separate bills. So I said, fine, I'm always willing to find middle ground. And we're able to do that. And in each of those positions, we found a way to do it with private partnerships, right? So you get basically the insurers, right? Insurers should be the insurance company, not the state. We felt this plan has the state hiring 50 or 60 people to essentially be the insurance company. But you have insurers being the insurance company. We would pay for paid family leave for our state employees. It creates a massive pool of those that are insured for a couple $1 million. And then all of a sudden, because you have 10,000 people insured at once, the premiums plummet. And now everybody else gets to share those low premiums. And when we asked private insurers whether they would be interested in this concept, we had a dozen of them show interest, which was great. We had the Commissioner of Employment Security, the Commissioner of Insurance. Those folks came up and said, yeah, this would work, and this is financially viable. Those same commissioners came out and said, Dan Feltus's plan is not financially viable. Those were their words, not mine. They testified in front of the legislature that said, we cannot guarantee the financial viability of this idea. So they have a mandatory income tax on it, which essentially makes the government a giant insurance company. And everyone has to pay a 0.5% tax. It's his words, Dan Feltus's words, not mine. Payments shall equal 0.5% of wages per employee per week. Those are his exact words in the plan. So that's an income tax, obviously. I mean, I don't care what you call it. It's payments of wages. That's an income tax, and that goes to the government, and everyone's got to pay. So that's a fundamental difference than the BET or the BPT. Those are taxes on profits. Those are taxes that are not paid by the workers. They're paid by the employers, and obviously, with the other federal taxes as well. So, and don't get me wrong, I'm trying to lower those. When I asked the Democrats to lower those taxes, they refused. They're trying to jack those taxes up as high as they can. One way or another, it hurts the workers. It hurts the ability for those businesses to be flexible. Whereas mine, you have an optional plan. If you want it, you can buy it. If you don't, you don't. And this is my biggest frustration. So they had 2 plans, a paid family leave plan that was optional and a paid family leave plan with an income tax. They knew I would veto an income tax. I think every governor, Republican or Democrat, should be vetoing an income tax. It's one of the reasons why we're such a desirable place to be for families and businesses, right? So they knew I was going to veto it, but that's the one they passed. Their priority was the income tax, not family leave. You cannot tell me that they really believed in paid family leave when they knew that I would have signed this plan. They had one that was ready to go, ready to be signed, and they said, we won't even hear it. We don't even want to get public testimony on it. We want the one with the income tax that we know, Governor, you're going to veto. Tell me where the priorities are. And that's the fundamental. Everyone in the state should be furious about that because they showed that in that moment, they showed what their priority was. It was about getting this 0.5% income tax. Oh, Governor, it's just a 0.5%. No income tax stays at a 0.5%. It's a 0.5% today. It's 2% tomorrow. It's 6% 5 years from now. We know where that's going to go. But again, the fact that Dan wants to tell people that he would veto an income tax when he wrote 2 of them, that he's against an income tax all of a sudden, when it was his words, not mine, that said payment shall equal 0.5% of workers' wages per week, mandatory, no way out. How is that not an income tax?
So let's talk about.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I thought there was, I apologize. I thought Tom was going to follow up. My bad.
He certainly could, but instead, let's talk about vetoes. It certainly has been a news-making thing over the past couple of legislative sessions. And so it might seem inevitable that when voters elect a Democratic majority in the legislature and a Republican governor or vice versa, that there's going to be some friction there. The Democratic leaders have said you're trying to legislate from the corner office. Do you see your position as just holding the fort or something else?
Look, I'm always going to hold the fort against extremes on both sides, right? I'm a middle of the road guy. I think people understand that. I've said no and ticked off a lot of conservatives. I've said no and ticked off a lot of ultra progressives. I had to veto a lot of bills because think about it. This legislation that they put in front of me, 80 pieces of it over the last 2 years, were bills that no governor had ever gotten on their desk before in history, ever. Like when the Democrats and John Lynch were running the show, they could have done it. They didn't, because that's how radical this stuff has been. It's so not in the interest of what Live Free or Die is all about, not in the interest of that New Hampshire advantage. So of course I'm going to veto extreme legislation like that. A lot of it came from national outside groups that were writing it for them. So I'm always willing to work in the middle. And people know, whether it's through the COVID crisis or through other pieces of legislation, I've upset people on both sides of the aisle. I got big shoulders. I can take the criticism. At the end of the day, I got to do what's right by 1.35 million people. They're counting on that. And I think far and large, people get that. And they understand we are always willing to be reasonable. We're always willing to find that middle ground. And that's why in 2019, with a fully Democrat legislature, I signed more bills than Maggie Hassan ever did. No one ever talks about that. I signed more pieces of legislation than Maggie Hassan ever did, even with all those vetoes. So we got more done than anyone's gotten done in years. So we've, I think, proven that there's a lot of good stuff that we can do together. And I'm more than willing to do that. Hundreds of pieces of legislation we found common ground on, right? The real radical stuff, of course I said no. I vetoed all of that. I'd veto it again. I would, because it was really out there stuff. I just got to be true to what New Hampshire's about today and making sure we're not just playing short-term political games. I know the legislature has different priorities. I don't care about the politics. I don't. I never have. I think people know that about me. Because my job is to make sure that we are setting ourselves up with an infrastructure 5, 10, 20 years from now, right? When we talk about DCYF and abused kids, rebuilding a whole new system for SUD, finally getting back from what was the worst mental health system in the country when I became governor, getting back to one of the best community-based mental health systems and redesigning that system too. I'll take on any challenge, right? There's always a better way to do it, but it has to be about accountability, not political talking points. At the end of the day, I believe every single elected official should be held accountable to their results. Not by what they say, not by the nice talking point or bills that just sound nice. And I get to, they get to say I vetoed a lot. At the end of the day, it's about results. And look at the results we have in this state. We had one of the strongest economies in the country coming into COVID. We made some tough decisions. Got a lot of guff on both sides, a lot from conservatives especially, who didn't like the stay-at-home orders and all that. We did the right thing. We ignored the politics. And what happened? I told everyone, just be patient. We're going to be smart about how we do it. We're going to open things up smartly. And we're back to having one of the strongest economies in the Northeast with some of the lowest COVID numbers. So you got to play for the results. And that's all I ask people to do. Our results on DCYF, absolute disaster when I became governor, right? Finally, after 10 years, we have more kids leaving foster care than coming into foster care. We have an adoption system that really works. We have prevention programs in DCYF. We had no prevention programs for so long. That's the data and the results that I want people to look at. And I think when they do, up and down the issues, I think they can say we've gotten better results. And I'm very proud of that. It doesn't mean we're perfect. Doesn't mean we don't have other issues. I'm an engineer by trade. I'm always there to design a new system, but know that you're never going to design it perfect the first time. You're just not. So you create flexibility in your legislation, flexibility in your approach. You always have a plan B and a plan C, and acknowledge hey, we tried something, it wasn't working. We got to pull back. We're going to go another route. That's okay. People just want that transparency. They want to know what's happening, not just looking at it through rose-colored glasses because you're worried about the politics. When you ignore the politics, you get so much more done. And that's why I was able to get so much done in 2019 with the legislature. 2020, it got very political, and COVID hit, and the whole world went upside down. But we got so much done with Democrats in 2020 as well. But we just had to say no to some of the extreme stuff that they put on my desk.
So would one of those extreme things that you vetoed be the Democratic bill to form a nonpartisan redistricting committee I mean, it seems like if the Democrats are controlling the legislature and they feel like that's going to continue to be the case into the next session, you would want to have some.
Yeah, if you cared about the politics, you would, but I don't care about the politics. That is a great idea. The independent redistricting idea is a very, very good idea. But let's look at that bill. It was impossible to operationalize, and I'm an operational guy. What it was going to do is say, I think it was, if I'm doing this off the top of my head, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats would effectively come up with a redistricting plan. And if it didn't happen, then it goes to the courts. There is no way you were going to get 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats to agree on a redistricting plan. It was never going to happen. So what ultimately was likely to happen was the courts were going to have the final say in redistricting, which would have taken away all the accountability that the citizens require. If the legislature can do it, that's wonderful. The legislature should do it. And that's their responsibility, and they should take that on. But the way they designed that idea, it sounds good on paper, but the way they designed it just wasn't going to happen. You weren't going to get agreement, and some nameless judge, accountable to nobody, was going to ultimately make the final decision on redistricting. So it was operationally, it was not going to work. I'm always willing to try, and I think if we can get back to the table and find a better way to do that, I'm all ears on it. I really am. But my job is to make sure that whatever goes on paper can actually come to fruition. It isn't just a false political promise. It isn't something that sounds nice on paper, but really can't happen. And in that case, not only would something not have happened, it would have had a disastrous result of basically forcing the whole issue into the courts. And I don't think anybody wants that.
Well, but that was...
Yeah, as I understand it, Governor, it was going to be an advisory commission in the latest iteration of the proposal. So it didn't bind the legislature in any way. And so that it wouldn't have been up to the courts to make any decision.
But if they came to no conclusion, it would read the bill. It went to the court. I mean, that was the final. If the legislature can't come to a conclusion, then it has to go to the court. That's in statute, and it might even be in the Constitution, frankly. So, but that bill talked about that. And so you essentially created this, what sounded nice and even keeled, but would have ended up in massive gridlock, and a judge would have made the final decision.
But so are you saying that that's already the way it is? If the legislature fails to come up with a plan, then it goes to the courts?
Technically it is, but remember, if you have the majority party, Democrat or Republican, whoever that might be, that's fine, and it very well could be Democrat this year. I don't know. I hope it's Republican, but it could be Democrat. But the majority party can almost always come to some sort of conclusion amongst themselves. You don't have that polarization of Republican versus Democrat that ultimately would lead into massive gridlock and no movement. So the majority party can almost always come to an agreement amongst themselves to make sure it moves forward. And that's why it's very, very rare that it actually ends up in the court. The system that they designed would have made it almost an absolute.
I don't see how an advisory committee that they didn't have to follow would have forced any change in
so if the advisory committee in that bill didn't come to a conclusion, what would have happened?
They would make a recommendation, and
no, but you have
Democrats
5 and 5.
would follow it or not.
No, they would. If you have 5 and 5, and they both completely disagree, then there's no recommendation, right? There's no advice.
But the legislative leaders could still come up with their own plan. They wouldn't.
So what you're saying
off
is
a recommendation.
So then, I have to go back and look at the bill. So then it's going to default back to the majority party.
Yeah, I guess. So what's the harm in having somebody
now
at least trying to look at
this
it?
partisanship in there that's just fundamentally not going to work. You have an advisory committee that has failed in their mission, that is designed, frankly, to fail in their mission. Look, the folks of the state elect representatives, and for hundreds of years, the representatives, every 10 years, whoever the majority party is, has done redistricting. And look, we have some districts that are kind of funky, not many, but we have a couple. But we don't have the massive gerrymandering problem you see in like these other states, right? So, have I always thought Executive Council District 2 looked kind of weird? Yeah, of course I did. But by and large, you don't have snakes of Senate districts or snakes of House of Representatives districts going everywhere. So, fundamentally, I wasn't going to put a system in place that ultimately could have led to a higher chance of the courts taking that over. That's just a bad idea. There's got to be a better way to do it.
So in your veto message for that bill, and it sounds like you're talking about this now, you called the legislature the most representative body in the country.
It is. We should all be very proud of that. That's great.
And previously you've spoken in veto messages about the upholding the will of the legislature. Yet the number of vetoes that you've had in the past couple of years seems to be an indication that you only support that will if the majority of the legislature is held by Republicans.
I've vetoed a lot of bills that were bipartisan. That independent redistricting bill that you just criticized me for vetoing had a lot of Republican support on it. I took a lot of guff from Republicans on that. So I haven't just vetoed Democrat-only bills by any means.
Excuse me. A few weeks ago, the state Supreme Court was hearing arguments over a lawsuit involving education funding. It's been 3 decades now since the Claremont decision, and a lot of school districts are still struggling with the burden of school taxes. Excuse me. What is the solution, and what can we be doing to look at that?
Are you talking about the solution of all this stuff in the courts, or the solution in terms of funding, or what?
Broader, the funding solution. What can we do to sort of ease the burden on local property taxes when it comes to school funding?
Okay. I put more public dollars into public education than any governor in history, and it's not even close. So we've provided that funding. I was the governor that restored the adequacy grants. So those districts that face the kind of the harshest realities of their property tax imbalance, we put that back up. I mean, it's millions of dollars to some of these cities and towns. Then you add in things like that take the burden off the property taxpayers, all the money we sent back to cities and towns. I'm the first governor and only governor in history to do safe school infrastructure grants, right? We remember when you had all the shootings and all this kind of stuff, we put $30 million out because we had extra money. And with extra money in Concord, other folks on the other side of the aisle want to create more government and more bigger programs. I believe when you have extra money, it's not our money, it's your money, right? It has to go back to the citizens. So by making those investments, whether it's even in roads and bridges or the revenue sharing that we did, or the safe school infrastructure grants, or you go down the list of all the cash, the hundreds of millions of dollars we put out to cities and towns, that takes a lot of the property tax burden off of those projects and gives them more flexibility at a localized level to make those investments into schools or wherever it really may be. One of the fundamental problems that the state has, and I've been trying to ring the bell on this, but everyone just wants to talk about the total dollars going into schools. But the fact of the matter is that the millennials and Gen Zs and the new gig generation, or whatever you want to call it, they're having less kids and they're having them later in life. So there's less actual students in the classroom. So fundamentally, there's just going to be less dollars going into those schools, and that's creating that's what is creating the massive crunch on the system. So even though our population is increasing in New Hampshire faster than almost anywhere else in the Northeast, because you have this generational difference in having kids and how kids are going to be in the classrooms, that's going to create a logjam, not just for today, but long term. And so districts have to have I know they don't like to have the hard conversations, but the hard conversations are, how are they planning from a school to school and district to district perspective to reduce their massive administration costs? The number of the amount of money we've put into public schools in the past 30 years has gone up 4 times. Would you say the quality of education has gone up 4 times? We still have some of the best schools in the country. I think we're ranked number 3 or 4 in the country for overall quality of education. So the quality is there. The results are there. We're doing very, very well. I think what you really have to do is making sure we're taking care of some of those very important ancillary funding streams, such as special education. I'm the first governor in a long time to fully fund special education. It was going just massively unfunded. And those are the kids that kind of fall through the cracks the most. They can have the biggest burden of cost, whereas I think they really should be the biggest opportunity to get the school systems up to par and even exceeding what they're used to doing. We had the whole crisis with Medicaid to schools, right? They changed the rules, and all of a sudden all this Medicaid money basically evaporated out of the schools. I fixed it. We came in and made sure that they had the funding. So you can't let these inadvertent holes go unattended to. Within months, we had that shored up. And then you have things like the pandemic, and saying, look, we know there's going to be costs. We're going to be there for you. So it isn't just the state coming in with one big sweeping measure. We're just going to pile all this money. Eventually we'll have enough money for the schools. There's this mentality that if we just eventually hit some magic number, everything will be okay. But it's never been enough. And the courts, of all people, should not have this final say in this, right? It's the legislature, those that are in charge of the purse, if you will, of the state, that really have to do the hard work to figure out a new formula, whatever it might be. We have more money going to schools, like not even close, than ever before. I mean, it's just unbelievable how much money is going there. It's up to the legislature to decide how that's supposed to be spent and dispersed, not up to some judge 30 years ago. I mean, Claremont was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster for the state. It highlighted an inequity and did nothing to solve it, right? So whether it's through a constitutional amendment or something else that's binding, there's a better way to reallocate those funds. But the total amount of money is there, right? When you add the local property tax base and the state support, the total dollars are there. I think we're ranked number 10 out of 50 in terms of total dollars spent per child in the country. So the dollars are there, the outcomes are there, there's some local inequities, and that should be really determined by the legislature. When you add in all the flexibility that we've provided for property taxpayers through my administration, there's a lot of ability to be flexible and have the legislature, I think, make the right decision for their cities and towns.
Okay, one other question that I had for you is, this is our area here, excuse me, in the Monadnock region is not the most expensive area in the state, but even so, it's hard to find housing at an affordable price. Readers have asked us, what do candidates think that they can possibly accomplish to address that issue?
So I think, a great bill. We brought in developers, we brought in local leaders. One of the bills that we had on the table that just evaporated because of COVID it was a great bill. I would say it was the most comprehensive housing bill that the state's had in 20 years, because it didn't just solve the problem, but it did create incentives for the locals to make better decisions about their housing stock and product and what they were going to permit and develop. And so we make a lot of our decisions at the localized level here. In Massachusetts, the state can just put their thumb down and effectively do a master permit for housing developments. We don't do that here. We believe in local control. It's tried and true, and that's likely not going to change. But what you ultimately have is, I was in Sugar Hill yesterday, quick story. And I met with the folks at Polly's Pancakes and the folks at the Cheese House and all this, and there were some folks there from the Sugar Hill Inn, and they were all talking about workforce and the fact that their town refused to permit anything in terms of not Section 8 housing, but just an apartment or a duplex or affordable condos, anything. But their town wasn't having any of it. And that story plays out over half to 3/4 of the towns and cities in this state, where the planning boards just don't want to permit this stuff. They think that those young families are going to be a burden on the tax base. They're going to be a burden on the system. They'd rather have 2 acres of $1 million homes, because those types of folks that move in typically don't bring the additional costs. That is like 1995 thinking. It is so old school, and it's causing a real problem. So what we're trying to do, what my bill did, and I'm going to bring it back in this next session, is create incentives for the towns. Like, I don't believe the state should come down with the stick, but incentives for when the town works with a business. Let me give you another quick example. Millipore in Jaffrey. And Jaffrey's a really good town. I don't want to come down negatively on them, but Millipore is something a little more in the Monadnock region. They're going to expand from like 900 to 1,400 employees in the next few years. Housing is the biggest barrier. So my bill would create incentives for Jaffrey and all the surrounding towns to work directly with Millipore to make those investments, allow the housing stock to be built. And the way folks are building it now is really cool, frankly. It doesn't look like workforce housing. I mean, there's that great project out in Walpole, right? If you've been out in Walpole lately, beautiful Walpole, right? It looks like a giant red barn, and it kind of blends into the countryside. It looks great. You have these young families coming in. And to the point I made about 10 minutes ago, towns have to understand they should want these young families coming in. They should want kids in their schools, because as the number of kids decrease per family, they should be fighting for kids in their schools to make sure they get the state support, so their classrooms don't go from 22 kids down to 15, right? Because then you have the same cost without the same financial support. So there are pathways to do this. I don't think our bill is the end-all be-all. It was very aggressive and progressive in terms of what it was, I think, able to do. We'll bring it back in the next session. And hopefully, I mean, part of it was simply as training, right? We talked to a lot of planning boards. A lot of them just didn't have experience permitting this type of housing. They had never had it before, and they just kind of were going on their, if I may, their old habits and their bad habits. And I've tried to get the business community to be the biggest advocates at those, with their selectmen or with their planning boards, because they're usually the biggest taxpayers, and they're the ones, they want that, the towns want that property tax base, they want the businesses, they have to be part of the solution to allowing those businesses to grow. Otherwise, the business is going to pick up and move. And overall, we've been fairly successful. But to your point, I mean, we have about a 1%, 1.5% vacancy rate in the whole state right now on apartments. That's insanely low. So you got to get more stock. People are moving in. They want to be here. We want them here. But the businesses and the towns have to work together with these incentives to create the product. It's there, but you're not going to get rid of local control. So the best thing you can do is help incentivize better decisions.
One other thing on that subject, you had placed a moratorium on evictions during the pandemic, but it did lapse. The CDC, the CDC order on evictions doesn't provide aid to renters or landlords. So are you concerned about a surge in evictions or homelessness when that expires at the end of this year?
No, well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have provided tens of millions of dollars. I think we have a $20 million fund for those who are having trouble paying their rent, paying their utilities, whatever it might be. It's open. It's run through all the 5 CAP agencies. It's a great program. We've already put millions and millions of dollars out for support for that. The number of evictions, if you look at, because no one was really being evicted, all that process stopped through the courts. If you look at the total number of evictions and this year versus last year, it's relatively the same. You had a bit of a surge in September and October because those are folks that were kind of backed up out of the March and April timeframe. But overall, we're not seeing a massive amount of evictions or foreclosures in the state at all. So when the moratorium goes away, I think we've provided a lot of financial support. I've worked very hard on our economy, on making sure that businesses had $500 million of aid. No other state in the country did that. No other state, not California. It's not even like per capita. California, New York, Florida, they did not put the $500 million out that I did for nonprofits, private businesses, self-employed. That allows those folks to keep their jobs, to keep those businesses viable. And that's why our unemployment rate is already well below 4.5% now, from 17 a couple months ago. So there's a job out there for folks. There are high-paying jobs. I think we still average one of the highest average household wages in the country. We have the lowest poverty rate in the country. So the opportunity is there. Everybody's looking for workers now. I mean, even at 4.5% unemployment, I don't know anyone who isn't looking for workers. We're kind of, if I may, back to that problem that we had back in January and February. We're already seeing the signs of it. So the opportunity's there, to be sure. The moratorium, I think, was very helpful for the time being. But now that the economy is really back on track, we have this fund providing a lot of financial support for folks. I feel confident that we're going to be kind of in a very similar situation, which was incredibly low foreclosures and evictions, given our population and demographics.
Switching topics to absentee ballots, which we talked about earlier, lots of people using them. So if everything goes well next month, fingers crossed, would you consider making that permanent for people who find that an easier way to vote than go into the polls?
Well, it already is permanent, if I may. We have a great absentee ballot system. It's been here for years and years, and it's tried and true. So it'll stay in place. Yeah,
sorry, I misspoke. I guess I was trying to say, it's widespread now. You don't have to have sort of the specific reasons, that are in the statute.
Well, yeah, you can check a box that says COVID now, right? So obviously that might not pertain to next year, but we always have a great turnout at our polls and with the absentee system. A lot of states I know have had to make different adjustments and all this kind of stuff. We just have a really good system. We have the highest voter turnout almost year after year, every year. So we've done a great job of making sure that everyone who wants to vote can vote. It's done safely, securely. We count the votes on election night. We, unless it's really close and there's a recount, we usually get a winner that night. So I think Secretary Gardner and Attorney General Gordon McDonald have done a phenomenal job, especially through COVID, If you remember, our primaries in September went off without a hitch. Our primary in February went off, pre-COVID without a hitch, and the primary in November is and the general election in November is going to go off great. So we got a great system. Absentee ballots are very easy to get in this state. They're going to continue to be very easy to. I mean, the only change, I guess, would be you won't check the box for COVID, right? But other than that, you can get an absentee ballot incredibly easy.
I guess, so, anybody that wanted one that said, absentee ballots worked for me, COVID's not an issue anymore, but I'd like to vote that way, but, I don't meet that specific criteria. Do you think that would be expanded at all? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, only if, and again, I'm trying to interpret the question and forgive me. If you're talking about like no excuse absentee voting, I'd probably say no. I think that can get you into some trouble. And I'm saying that because I work with Secretary Gardner, one of the best in the country at understanding these issues. We already have such a high voter turnout. There's no voter suppression here, nothing like that you see in issues that might have in other states. When you already have one of the highest voter turnouts in the country, we're doing it really well. So the no excuse absentee voting I get concerned with, because the Attorney General, Secretary of State, and seeing some of the problems that have spurred up in other states, we don't want to kind of necessarily do that without really understanding the dynamics of it. And I think right now we get great results. And it's one of those things where we're getting great results. I get a little nervous about massively upheaving the system if it's already working very, very well.
So, Governor, we've taken up a lot of your time, and we've certainly appreciate it.
This is a lot more fun than, this is more fun than having to manage COVID, because that's a stress test.
I'm sure it is. I just have one last topic, and then if Mia has any follow-up questions, she may ask you to stay on or not. Regarding the Supreme Court vacancy, that we have, not the federal one. If the Executive Council remains having a Democratic majority moving forward, would you continue to wait to nominate somebody for that position?
No, I feel comfortable. I think I'll feel comfortable. I can't predict the future moving forward. Look, whoever is sitting in that Executive Council, I don't care whether it's 5 Democrats or 5 Republicans. At the end of the day, they've got to not put politics in the mix. That was the number one reason they didn't want to vote for Gordon McDonnell. All we heard is Republican. And when you have, dozens of very liberal, very Democrat, very well established and esteemed judges, the former Chief Justice of the Superior Court, when John Broderick comes up and says, this is the guy, the court would be so well served with someone like Gordon McDonnell, right? Both sides of the aisle in unprecedented fashion saying Gordon is one of the best legal minds the state has had in decades. That's literally what was said at his hearings time after time, but it was politics. So my question would be to the council, please, what can you do to assure that politics isn't going to come into play? Whether it's someone on the Board of Education, and that was terrible what the council did to Ryan Terrell at the Board of Education, what they did to Eddie Edwards, right, with saying he wasn't qualified. He's one of the most qualified guys for the position, or what they did to Gordon McDonnell. That was politics every time. And that was completely inappropriate. 200 years as a former member of the Executive Council, 200 years that body has worked in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way. At one time, I'm one of the few people to sit on the Executive Council where I was part of a majority and part of a minority. I was part of the minority with a Democrat governor, part of a majority with a Democrat governor. So I've seen it all from all angles. And it always worked. We always found a way to work together and to make sure politics wasn't the driver. We got a lot done on the council when I sat next to Colin Van Osteren on the council, and Colin was running for governor and I was running for governor. But you know what? We found a way to get a lot of stuff done and not let politics. If you remember 2016, very rarely was the council politically driven on what it was doing. I can't remember almost any instances. We found a lot of agreement, and we always put, when it came to nominees of the court, I don't ask, what is your position on this and this? I've never asked somebody what their litmus test position is on any issue. You know why? It's completely inappropriate. It is completely inappropriate. And in fact, it would be inappropriate for them to answer, right? From a judicial conduct standpoint. So, I don't care. I've nominated Republicans. I've nominated Democrats to be judges. I always look at the individual about upholding the law, not about the politics. This council in the last 2 years has been reprehensible. And I don't mind using, I know that's a strong word, but the fact is it hasn't been like this ever in the history of the state. And I think if I may, what Councilor Pignatelli and Councilor Valinsky and Councilor Cryans did to some of those individuals, I had folks calling me up saying, Governor, I know you're thinking of me for a district judge. I don't put my name forward. I don't want to be part of that. Can you imagine, how hard it is to get people to step up to want to serve the state in that fashion? And then they're calling me and saying, I don't want to do it. Don't put me in front of that group. That's terrible. That set a terrible tone for our state. So I would work with the council, no matter who becomes executive council, just to try to ensure that we don't go down that very dangerous and disastrous path again. And again, I've nominated Republicans, I've nominated Democrats. So it's not, the issue isn't on me. It was really on those individuals, and I hope there's a big turnover on the council. And again, making sure that it really acts the way it should and not consider Republican, Democrat, not have litmus tests for everyone, and listen to those folks who come forward like they did for Gordon McDonald in unbelievable numbers, saying this is the guy on both sides of the party. In fact, he might have had more Democrats than Republicans supporting him at his hearing. I don't even remember, but it was an amazing amount because it wasn't political at all. It was just about the individual and how they would serve the state, and that's the tone we have to bring back to the council.
All right. Well,
I just wanted to ask a quick question while you're here. So there was a story that NHPR reported last month about how some of the local clerks sent a letter to you asking for a change in how you know what I'm talking about, the change in how the ballots and the check mark. Do you know if that's been resolved yet? They were talking how that might create a logjam.
Sure. So I think a letter went out literally a day or two ago, if it has gone out already, or maybe it's even going out today. So I'm summarizing here, but what the clerks were looking for is, because you get so many absentee ballots coming in, they said, hey, can we open it and kind of check people off the list a little early? We won't count them until day of. We'll follow the rules there, but can we open them a little early? And effectively, constitutionally, you can't do that because it's funny. If you send in an absentee ballot, you still have the right to come in on election day and vote. You can say, you know what, I sent my absentee in, don't count that one, I'm going to vote today. So if you cut people off the list, you're suppressing a vote. And so Secretary Gardner and the Attorney General put a letter together that came back and said, well, you can't take them off the list like you're asking, but maybe you highlight them, you give them another symbol, you identify them in some different way. So you can open the ballots, identify them a different way, but please don't take them off the list. And so I think what they were asking for probably cannot be done. But again, one of the best parts of our state is that you have an Attorney General and a Secretary of State that can work with virtually every city and town directly. I mean, they have direct connection to all these folks, and they have a direct line to these individuals. That's a very unique thing. You don't find that in almost any other state. So I don't think and it's really from them. I think the letter came to me, but I'm on the ballot. I defer to the experts, and I think there'd even be a conflict if I were to weigh in on it in any way. But I believe the answer ultimately was, well, we understand the issue. What they're asking for probably technically can't be done, but we know the benefit of what they're trying to do, so here's another way around it. I think that's where we're going to go.
all right. Well, then I think we'll let you get back to the painful work of dealing with the pandemic
We're doing good.
and campaigning. Since you're now into that.
I'd probably rather deal with the pandemic than campaigning. My goodness. I hate campaigning.
Well, you've done okay with it so far. So a couple campaigns. And we wish you good luck November 3rd. And we appreciate your time. It's always good to talk with you, Governor.
Thank you, guys.